Billionaire mistook poor girl for gold digger and humiliated her. Turns out she's the heiress who owns his company. Look, I'm not trying to be cruel, but that dress, the way you're studying the auction catalog like you're calculating what you can afford, it's obvious you're out of your league here. These events aren't really for people like you. The woman in the simple black dress stood frozen, her hands clenched at her sides. When she finally looked up at the billionaire who had just humiliated her in front of Manhattan's elite, her emerald eyes held something far more dangerous than anger. Disappointment. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for showing me exactly who you are." What Damien Ashworth didn't know as he watched her walk away was that this nobody he'd just dismissed as a gold digger actually owned 38% of his billion-dollar empire. And in exactly 72 hours, she was about to destroy everything he'd built with a single board meeting. If you've ever witnessed karma in action, hit that like button, and stick around because this story will blow your mind. 3 days earlier, Damien Ashworth had stood on the 42nd floor of his Manhattan tower, surveying an empire worth over $3 billion. At 32, he commanded boardrooms with the same ease others ordered coffee. Ashworth Dynamics wasn't just a tech company. It was a monument to his brilliance, his vision, his ruthless ability to separate winners from losers. "Mr. Ashworth," his assistant Marcus called from the doorway, "the car is ready for the charity gala." Damien adjusted his custom Armani cufflinks and grabbed his phone. Tonight's event at the Meridian Grand Ballroom was just another networking opportunity. Another chance to expand his influence among Manhattan's power brokers. "Remember, I need to speak with the Whitmore family about the shipping contracts," Damien said as they descended in his private elevator. "And if anyone approaches me looking like they don't belong, redirect them to the volunteer registration table." Marcus nodded, accustomed to his boss's blunt efficiency. Damien had built his fortune by reading people quickly. Separating the valuable connections from the social climbers. The genuine philanthropists from those seeking tax write-offs or wealthy husbands. The Meridian Grand Ballroom glittered like a jewelry box when Damien arrived. Crystal chandeliers cast fractured rainbows across marble floors while Manhattan's elite mingled in designer gowns and tailored suits. He recognized familiar faces. Tech moguls, real estate dynasties, old money families whose influence stretched back generations. "Damien, darling." Victoria Whitmore glided toward him in a gown that cost more than most people's annual salary. Her smile was predatory beneath perfectly applied makeup. "I've been looking everywhere for you." "Victoria," he replied with practiced charm, accepting her air kisses while mentally cataloging her motivations. The Whitmore shipping contracts were up for renewal next quarter. "You look stunning tonight." "Thank you, but I'm more interested in discussing that cybersecurity proposal your team sent over," she laughed, the sound calculated and musical. "Perhaps over dinner tomorrow?" Before Damien could respond, a commotion near the entrance caught his attention. A young woman had stumbled slightly, her simple black dress clearly off the rack, marking her as distinctly out of place among the designer gowns and tailored suits. Her dark hair was pulled back in an elegant but modest chignon, and she wore no jewelry except for small pearl earrings that looked like they might have belonged to her grandmother. "Excuse me," Damien murmured to Victoria, his attention inexplicably drawn to the newcomer. There was something about her posture, the way she carried herself despite her obvious discomfort, that intrigued him. He approached her just as she was studying the auction catalog, her brow furrowed in concentration. Up close, she was even more beautiful. Not in the polished, artificial way of the women he usually encountered, but with a natural grace that needed no enhancement. Her skin was luminous without heavy makeup, her full lips curved in a slight frown as she examined the lot descriptions. "First time at one of these events?" he asked, his voice carrying just enough condescension to establish his superior position in this social hierarchy. She looked up, startled, and Damien found himself staring into the most extraordinary eyes he'd ever seen. Deep emerald green with flecks of gold that seemed to catch the light. For a moment, something flickered in those depths, an intelligence that made him pause. "Yes," she replied softly, her voice carrying a slight accent he couldn't quite place. "It's all quite impressive." Isabella Moreau, she added, extending a hand that was smooth but bore no signs of professional manicures or expensive treatments. Damien Ashworth, he replied, noting how her fingers trembled slightly in his grip. The reaction was familiar. Most people were intimidated when they learned his identity. What brings you here tonight? Are you interested in making a substantial donation? The question was pointed, designed to gauge her financial capacity. Her simple attire and obvious nervousness suggested she was probably a mid-level professional trying to network above her station, possibly hoping to catch the attention of a wealthy benefactor. Isabella's cheeks flushed slightly. I believe in the cause. Children's literacy is important. Of course, Damien replied, his tone becoming more patronizing. Though I imagine the ticket price alone was quite a stretch for someone in your situation. The words hung in the air, and he watched her face change, hurt flashing across her features before being quickly masked. She straightened her shoulders, and for a moment, something dangerous glittered in her eyes. My situation, she repeated quietly. Don't take offense, Damien continued, warming to his theme. He'd encountered countless women who attended these events hoping to attract wealthy husbands, and he prided himself on recognizing them quickly. I admire ambition. But you should know that most of the men here can spot a gold digger from across the room. The color drained from Isabella's face as if he'd physically struck her. Around them, nearby conversations continued, but Damien noticed several people glancing in their direction, drawn by the tension crackling between them. A gold digger, she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Look, I'm not trying to be cruel, Damien said, convincing himself he was being kind by being direct. But that dress, the way you're studying the auction catalog like you're calculating what you can afford, it's obvious you're out of your league here. These events aren't really for people like you. Isabella stood frozen for a long moment, her hands clenched at her sides. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but ice-cold. People like me. Come on, Damien pressed, his confidence growing as he misread her stillness for submission. You're clearly struggling financially, probably working some entry-level job, hoping to meet a wealthy man who'll solve all your problems. There's no shame in wanting a better life, but you should be honest about your intentions. The silence that followed was deafening. Isabella's face had gone completely pale except for 2 spots of color high on her cheekbones. When she finally looked up at him, her eyes held a look he'd never seen before. Not hurt or anger, but something far more dangerous. Disappointment. Thank you, she said quietly, for showing me exactly who you are. Without another word, she turned and walked away, her simple black dress somehow managing to look more elegant than any of the designer gowns surrounding them. Damien watched her go, feeling an unexpected pang of something that might have been regret. My, Victoria's voice appeared at his elbow, making him jump. That was quite the performance. Who was she? Nobody important, Damien replied automatically, but his eyes remained fixed on the doorway where Isabella had disappeared. For the rest of the evening, Damien found himself distracted. He went through the motions of networking, discussing business deals and market trends, but his mind kept returning to those emerald eyes and the quiet dignity with which Isabella had walked away. Something about the encounter unsettled him, though he couldn't pinpoint why. Monday morning arrived with typical New York efficiency. Damien was in his corner office on the 42nd floor of Ashworth Tower, reviewing quarterly reports, when Marcus burst through the door without knocking. This breach of protocol immediately set Damien on edge. Sir, we have a problem, Marcus said, his usually composed demeanor cracked with anxiety. A big problem. Damien looked up from his laptop, noting the pallor of his assistant's face. What kind of problem? The Moreau Group, Marcus said, setting a thick folder on Damien's desk with trembling hands. They've called an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning. Damien frowned. The Moreau Group was Ashworth Dynamics' largest investor, holding 38% of the company's shares. Enough to influence major decisions but not enough for outright control. In the 5 years since they'd invested, they'd been completely hands-off, communicating only through lawyers and financial advisors. Damien had never even met the mysterious heir who controlled the family fortune. "What's the agenda?" he asked, already reaching for the folder. Marcus swallowed hard. "They're calling for a vote of no confidence in current leadership." The words hit Damien like a physical blow. In corporate terms, it was a polite way of saying they wanted him fired from his own company. "That's impossible. My contract." "Your contract protects you from hostile takeovers," Marcus interrupted, "but if the board votes that you're not acting in the company's best interests, especially with the Moreau Group's backing." Damien's mind raced. The Moreau Group had invested when Ashworth Dynamics was struggling, providing the capital that had allowed him to build his empire. But they'd always been silent partners, content to collect their substantial dividends without interfering in operations. Something had changed, but what? "Do we know why?" he asked, his voice tight with controlled panic. Marcus hesitated. "The official statement mentions concerns about leadership integrity and company values." "But sir, there's something else. The Moreau heir is coming to the meeting. In person." For 5 years, the mysterious head of the Moreau Group had remained completely anonymous, conducting all business through intermediaries. Damien had often wondered about the person who controlled such vast wealth while maintaining such complete privacy. "Do we know anything about them?" "That's just it," Marcus said, his voice strange. "We do now. The legal team just sent over the updated shareholder information for tomorrow's meeting." He handed Damien a single sheet of paper. At the top, in stark black letters, was a name that made Damien's blood run cold. Isabella Moreau, Chairman and CEO, Moreau Group Holdings. The document slipped from Damien's nerveless fingers. The woman he'd humiliated 3 nights ago, the one he'd dismissed as a gold-digging opportunist, owned nearly 40% of his company. She wasn't some struggling nobody hoping to catch a wealthy husband. She was one of the most powerful people in the city, and he treated her like dirt. "Sir." Marcus's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Are you all right?" Damien stared at the paper on his desk, his mind reeling as pieces fell into place. Isabella's composure despite her obvious discomfort at the gala. The way she'd studied the auction catalog, not calculating what she could afford, but probably noting which lots her foundation might want to bid on. The flash of intelligence in her eyes that he dismissed as social climbing. "The Children's Literacy Charity," he said suddenly. "Sir." The gala was for children's literacy. "Marcus, look up the Moreau Foundation's major donations." Marcus's fingers flew over his tablet. His face went even paler. "Education initiatives. Children's literacy programs specifically. They've donated over $50 million in the past 3 years alone." Damien felt sick. Isabella hadn't been there as some desperate social climber. She'd been there supporting a cause she genuinely cared about, probably one her own foundation funded. And he'd stood there in his ignorance and arrogance, lecturing her about gold diggers and knowing her place. "What else?" he asked, dreading the answer. "The Moreau Group has major holdings in tech, real estate, and renewable energy." Isabella Moreau graduated summa cum laude from Harvard Business School, speaks 4 languages, and inherited control of the family empire when she turned 25. She's known for being intensely private and for testing potential business partners by meeting them incognito. The last piece of information hit Damien like a punch to the gut. She'd been testing him, giving him a chance to show his true character when he thought she was nobody important. And he'd failed spectacularly. "Cancel my meetings for the rest of the day," he said quietly. "Sir, the Richardson presentation." "Cancel everything." Damien's voice was hollow. "I need to think." That evening, Damien sat alone in his penthouse apartment, staring out at the city lights while nursing a glass of whiskey that had long since grown warm. His mind kept returning to that moment at the gala, the look in Isabella's eyes when he'd called her a gold digger. Not anger or indignation, but profound disappointment, as if she'd hoped for better and been let down. He'd built his entire identity around being successful, powerful, someone who commanded respect. But in that ballroom, he'd revealed himself to be small, petty, and cruel. Worse, he'd done it to someone who could destroy everything he'd worked for with a single phone call. But even beyond the business implications, something else ate at him. The way Isabella had carried herself with quiet dignity even as he'd attacked her character. The flash of hurt in her eyes before she'd masked it. The graceful way she'd walked away without defending herself or revealing who she really was. His phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Board meeting moved to 8 a.m. Ms. Moreau's representatives confirmed she'll be attending in person. Damien closed his eyes, trying to imagine facing Isabella across a boardroom table. Would she fire him immediately? Destroy his reputation? He almost hoped she would. It would be simpler than trying to explain behavior that had no excuse. The next morning arrived too quickly. Damien entered the Ashworth Dynamics boardroom to find it already half full with the company's board of directors, their faces grave with the weight of the situation. At the head of the table sat a figure he recognized despite her dramatically different appearance. Isabella wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than most people's cars, her dark hair swept into a severe chignon that emphasized the elegant line of her neck. Diamond earrings caught the light as she turned her head, and a simple but clearly expensive watch adorned her wrist. She looked every inch the billionaire heiress she was, and Damien realized how blind he'd been to miss the signs of her true status. "Mr. Ashworth," she said when he entered, her voice perfectly professional. "Please, take a seat." Her tone was courteous but cold, giving nothing away. The other board members watched the exchange with obvious fascination. Clearly, word had spread about the connection between the two. "Thank you all for coming," Isabella began, her voice carrying the natural authority of someone accustomed to command. "I've called this meeting to address some serious concerns about the leadership and direction of Ashworth Dynamics." She activated a presentation screen, displaying a series of charts and graphs. While the company's financial performance has been strong, recent events have raised questions about whether current leadership reflects the values and integrity that our investors expect. Damien's throat felt dry as desert sand. She was going to do it. Destroy him professionally with the same clinical precision he'd once admired in hostile takeovers. Specifically, Isabella continued, there have been reports of behavior that suggests a fundamental lack of respect for others, particularly those perceived as having less power or status. The words were carefully chosen, professional enough for a boardroom but clearly referencing their encounter at the gala. Several board members shifted uncomfortably, sensing the personal undertones beneath the corporate language. "Ms. Moreau," interrupted board member Richard Blackwood, "surely these are minor personality issues that don't affect Mr. Ashworth's ability to run the company effectively." Isabella's green eyes fixed on Blackwood with laser intensity. "Character isn't a minor issue, Mr. Blackwood. How a leader treats those they perceive as powerless reveals their true nature. It affects every decision they make, every relationship they build, every strategic choice they implement." She turned back to the presentation, pulling up employee satisfaction surveys and client feedback reports. These metrics show concerning trends in company culture and client relations that I believe stem directly from leadership attitudes. Damien wanted to defend himself, to explain that he wasn't usually so cruel, but he knew anything he said would only make things worse. The evidence was damning, made more so by the fact that Isabella had experienced his behavior firsthand. "The Moreau Group has been a silent partner in this company for 5 years, Isabella continued, because we believed in its potential and its leadership. However, recent events have forced us to reconsider whether current management aligns with our values and expectations." She paused, her gaze moving around the table before settling on Damien. "Therefore, I am proposing a 6-month probationary period during which Mr. Ashworth will remain as CEO but under direct oversight from the Moreau Group. If significant improvements in leadership style and company culture are not demonstrated, we will move forward with the vote of no confidence." The room fell silent. It wasn't the immediate firing Damien had expected, but it was humiliating in its own way. Being placed on corporate probation like a misbehaving child. What specific improvements are you looking for? Asked board member Patricia Chen. Isabella's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Demonstrable changes in how leadership treats all stakeholders, regardless of their perceived status or value. Evidence of genuine character growth, not just surface-level behavioral modification. The meeting continued for another hour, with Isabella outlining specific metrics and reporting requirements. Throughout it all, Damien sat in stunned silence, watching the woman he dismissed as unimportant systematically dismantle his autonomy while somehow still leaving him a path to redemption. As the other board members filed out, Isabella remained seated, organizing her papers with calm efficiency. Damien hesitated at the door, knowing he should leave but unable to walk away without saying something. "Isabella," he began, then stopped, unsure how to address her. "Ms. Moreau." "Mr. Ashworth." She looked up from her papers, her expression neutral. "Do you have something you'd like to say?" The professional distance in her voice was more devastating than anger would have been. "I want to apologize. What I said at the gala, how I treated you, it was inexcusable." "Yes," she agreed quietly. "It was." The simple acknowledgement hit harder than any accusation. She didn't argue with him, didn't give him an opening to justify or explain. She simply agreed that his behavior had been terrible. "I don't know why I acted that way," he continued, desperation creeping into his voice. "I'm not usually. I don't normally treat people like that." Isabella studied him for a long moment. "Don't you?" The question hung in the air between them. Damien opened his mouth to deny it, then stopped. How many times had he dismissed people based on their appearance or perceived status? How many service workers had he barely acknowledged? How many junior employees had he overlooked or undervalued? "I think you do," Isabella said softly. "I think that's exactly who you usually are. The only difference is that this time, you targeted someone who had the power to hold you accountable." The words were delivered without malice, but they cut deeper than any angry tirade could have. She was right, and they both knew it. "So what happens now?" he asked. Isabella stood, gathering her papers with practiced efficiency. "Now you have 6 months to prove that you're capable of change. Real change, not just better public relations." She paused at the door, looking back at him with an expression he couldn't read. "The question is whether you want to change because you're facing consequences, or because you genuinely understand why your behavior was wrong. This is where everything changes." Comment below if you think Damien deserves what's coming to him. Over the following weeks, Damien found himself under constant scrutiny. Isabella had installed her own representatives throughout the company. Not as spies, but as consultants tasked with implementing cultural improvements. Every decision he made, every interaction he had, was being evaluated against new standards of respect and integrity. Maria Santos, Isabella's lead consultant, shadowed Damien through meetings and company events. At first, he resented the oversight. He was used to being the unquestioned authority in his own company, and having his every move monitored felt like professional humiliation. But gradually, he began to see things differently. During a staff meeting about quarterly projections, he watched Maria take notes as junior analyst Kevin Morrison presented his findings. 6 months ago, Damien would have barely acknowledged Kevin's contribution, focused instead on the senior executives. But now he forced himself to listen, really listen, to the young man's insights. "Excellent analysis, Kevin," he said when the presentation concluded. "Your data on the Southeast market trend is particularly valuable. How did you identify that pattern?" Kevin's face lit up with surprise and pride. "I noticed some unusual buying patterns in our client data and cross-referenced them with regional economic reports." "That's exactly the kind of innovative thinking we need," Damien replied. "Would you be interested in presenting this to our strategy team next week?" It was such a small thing, but Damien realized he'd never bothered to acknowledge individual contributions from lower-level employees before. He'd taken their work for granted, crediting only the managers who compiled their efforts. After the meeting, Maria approached him. "That was genuine," she said simply. "Kevin will remember that conversation for years." "It was just basic courtesy," Damien replied. "Exactly," Maria said. "Basic courtesy that you've never shown before." The changes weren't just professional. Damien began noticing details he'd previously ignored. The security guard who worked double shifts to support his family. The cleaning staff who arrived before dawn to prepare the offices. The cafeteria workers who knew every employee's coffee preferences. People he'd walked past for years without really seeing suddenly became individuals with names, stories, and inherent worth. One evening, as Damien was leaving late, he encountered Robert, the night security guard, reading a textbook at his desk. "Studying?" Damien asked, genuinely curious. Robert looked up, surprised that the CEO was speaking to him. "Yes, sir. Working on my accounting degree. Night classes 3 times a week." "That's impressive," Damien said. "How long have you been at it?" "For years now," Robert replied. "Should finish next year. Hoping to move into the finance department eventually." "Have you spoken with HR about internal opportunities?" Damien asked. "We should make sure you're aware of openings that match your qualifications." Robert's eyes widened. "No, sir. I didn't think. I mean, I wasn't sure if." "You've been a dedicated employee for how long?" 7 years, sir." "Then you deserve consideration for advancement," Damien said firmly. "I'll speak with HR tomorrow." As he walked to his car, Damien reflected on how simple that interaction had been. Robert wasn't seeking special treatment or handouts. He was working hard to improve his situation while faithfully performing his current duties. All he'd needed was acknowledgement and a fair chance. But the most challenging part wasn't changing his behavior. It was facing the reflection of who he'd been. Every courteous interaction, every moment of genuine respect he showed to someone regardless of their status, reminded him of the man he'd been at that gala. The man who'd looked at Isabella and seen only what he wanted to see, who'd let his prejudices and assumptions override basic human decency. 3 months into his probationary period, Damien was working late when he heard voices in the hallway outside his office. Through the glass walls, he could see Isabella speaking with Maria Santos, their heads bent over a tablet displaying what looked like employee satisfaction metrics. He watched Isabella interact with Maria, asking thoughtful questions, listening intently to responses, treating her colleague with the same respect she'd show a fellow CEO. It was exactly how she treated everyone at the gala, he realized. She didn't adjust her courtesy based on someone's perceived importance. Isabella looked up and caught him watching. For a moment, their eyes met through the glass, and something passed between them. Not hostility, but not warmth either. Then she returned to her conversation, leaving Damien with the uncomfortable awareness that he was being evaluated just as thoroughly as he was evaluating himself. Later that evening, as he prepared to leave the office, he found Isabella in the lobby, speaking on her phone in what sounded like rapid French. She was arranging transportation for a visiting client, ensuring every detail was perfectly coordinated despite the late hour. "Working late?" he asked when she ended the call. "The Dubois acquisition requires some delicate handling," she replied professionally. "They're old-fashioned about business relationships. They want to feel valued, not just profitable." Damien nodded, recognizing the wisdom in her approach. "How do you do it?" "Do what?" "Treat everyone the same way. With the same level of respect and attention. Whether they're a CEO or a security guard." Isabella studied him for a moment, as if trying to determine whether the question was genuine. "Because everyone deserves it," she said simply. "Success, wealth, status, those are circumstances, not measures of worth." "It's not that simple," Damien protested. "Time is limited. You have to prioritize." "Do you?" Isabella asked. How much time does it take to learn someone's name? To say thank you? To acknowledge that they're a person, not just a function? The questions hit home because Damien knew she was right. The changes he'd been making didn't require more time. They required more attention, more intention, more basic human decency. At the gala, he said quietly, "You could have told me who you were. You could have stopped my speech with a single sentence." Isabella's expression softened slightly. "Yes, I could have. Why didn't you?" She was quiet for so long that Damien thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was almost too soft to hear. "Because I wanted to see who you really were when you thought it didn't matter. When you thought there would be no consequences." She looked at him directly. "And you showed me." The words weren't accusatory, just sad. Damien felt something crack inside his chest, a painful awareness of how completely he'd failed not just her, but every version of himself he'd ever wanted to be. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it more than he'd ever meant anything. "Not because you turned out to be important, but because no one deserves to be treated that way. Ever." Isabella studied his face for a long moment. "I know," she said finally. "I can see the difference." They stood in the lobby as the city lights twinkled beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, two people navigating the complicated space between forgiveness and trust. "The 6 months are almost up," Damien said. "Yes. What happens next?" Isabella smiled, and for the first time since the gala, it reached her eyes. "That depends on you, Mr. Ashworth. Have you learned what you needed to learn?" As Damien looked at her, really looked at her, seeing not just her beauty or her power but the grace with which she wielded both, he realized the answer wasn't about his company or his career. It was about the man he was becoming versus the man he'd been. "I'm still learning," he said honestly. "But yes, I think I have." Over the next few weeks, something shifted between them. Their professional interactions remained formal, but there were moments. A shared glance during a board presentation. A brief conversation about company strategy that extended beyond business necessity. The gradual recognition that they shared similar values about ethical leadership and social responsibility. Isabella began visiting the office more frequently, working closely with department heads to implement long-term cultural improvements. Damien found himself looking forward to these visits, not just because they signaled progress in his probationary review, but because he genuinely valued her perspective. During one late evening strategy session, they found themselves alone in the conference room, reviewing plans for the company's expansion into sustainable technology markets. "This could transform the entire industry," Isabella said, studying the projections. "Clean energy solutions with real commercial viability." "It's risky," Damien admitted. "The initial investment is substantial, and there's no guarantee of market acceptance." "The best innovations are always risky," Isabella replied. "That's why most companies settle for incremental improvements instead of breakthrough advances." As they worked together, Damien found himself drawn not just to Isabella's business acumen, but to her passion for using corporate success to drive positive social change. She wasn't interested in profit for its own sake, but in building something meaningful and lasting. "Can I ask you something personal?" he said during a break in their discussions. Isabella looked up from her notes. "You can ask. Why did you give me a second chance? At the board meeting, I mean. You could have fired me immediately. You had every right to." Isabella set down her pen and considered the question carefully. "Because destruction is easy," she said finally. "Any fool can tear something down. Building something better requires vision, patience, and the belief that people can change. But I humiliated you publicly. I judged you based on the most superficial criteria imaginable." "Yes, you did," she agreed. "And for about 5 minutes after I left that gala, I wanted to destroy everything you'd built. I wanted you to feel as small and worthless as you'd made me feel." The honesty in her voice made Damien's chest tight. "What changed your mind?" "I realized that revenge would make me just as small as the man who'd hurt me. She turned back to him, her green eyes serious. And more importantly, I saw potential for something better. Better? A partnership between equals. Someone who understands operational excellence and someone who understands that business success means nothing without human integrity. She smiled, and this time it was warm, genuine. I think we could build something extraordinary together. Are you rooting for Damien's transformation, or do you think he doesn't deserve forgiveness? Let me know in the comments. 6 months after the emergency board meeting, Damien stood once again in the Ashworth Dynamics boardroom. This time, the atmosphere was different. Expectant rather than hostile, curious rather than condemning. Isabella sat at the head of the table, but she was no longer the cool, untouchable figure from that first confrontation. Over the months of working together, she'd shown glimpses of the woman beneath the professional armor. Someone passionate about justice, fiercely intelligent, and surprisingly kind despite having every reason to be bitter. The probationary period has concluded, she announced to the assembled board members. The metrics show significant improvement in employee satisfaction, client relationships, and overall company culture. She activated the presentation screen, displaying charts that told the story of transformation. Employee retention was up, customer complaints were down, and internal reviews showed marked improvement in leadership effectiveness. Furthermore, Isabella continued, the financial performance during this period has exceeded projections, suggesting that these cultural changes have actually enhanced rather than hindered business operations. Board member Patricia Chen leaned forward. So you're satisfied with Mr. Ashworth's progress? Isabella's eyes found Damien's across the table. I'm satisfied that Mr. Ashworth has demonstrated genuine change, not just behavioral compliance. The question now is how we move forward. She stood, her bearing confident but somehow less intimidating than it had been 6 months ago. The Moreau Group is prepared to withdraw the vote of no confidence. However, we propose a new partnership structure that would make our oversight permanent. Not as probation, but as true collaboration. Damien's eyebrows rose in surprise. This wasn't what he'd expected. We're proposing a co-CEO structure, Isabella explained. Mr. Ashworth would maintain operational control while I would oversee strategic development and cultural initiatives. The Moreau Group would increase our investment by an additional $500 million to fund expansion into sustainable technology markets. The room buzzed with excitement. It was an extraordinary proposal. One that would catapult Ashworth Dynamics into the top tier of tech companies while ensuring the cultural changes became permanent. What would this mean day to day? Asked Richard Blackwood. Shared decision-making on major initiatives, Isabella replied. Joint representation at industry events. Collaborative leadership that demonstrates our commitment to both financial success and ethical business practices. After the board voted unanimously to approve the new structure, the members filed out with congratulatory handshakes and excited discussions about the company's future. Once again, Damien found himself alone with Isabella in the boardroom. Co-COS, he said, testing the words. That's not what I expected. What did you expect? Honestly? I thought you might fire me and move on. You certainly had the right to. Isabella moved to the window, gazing out at the city skyline. I thought about it, she admitted. For about 5 minutes after the gala, I wanted to destroy everything you'd built. I wanted you to feel as small and worthless as you'd made me feel. The honesty in her voice made Damien's chest tight. What changed your mind? I realized that revenge would make me just as small as the man who'd hurt me. She turned back to him, her green eyes serious. And more importantly, I saw potential for something better. Better? A partnership between equals. Someone who understands operational excellence and someone who understands that business success means nothing without human integrity. She smiled, and this time it was warm, genuine. I think we could build something extraordinary together. Damien felt a shift in the air between them, a recognition that went beyond business partnerships or professional collaboration. Isabella, he said softly, I need you to know. These past 6 months, working with you, seeing how you approach everything with such grace and intelligence, it's changed more than just how I run my company. Oh. Her voice was carefully neutral, but he caught the slight flush in her cheeks. It's changed how I see everything. How I see myself. How I see what matters. He moved closer, close enough to catch the subtle scent of her perfume. How I see you. Damien. I know I have no right to ask, he continued, his voice rough with emotion. I know I hurt you, disrespected you, judged you based on the most superficial nonsense. But I'm hoping. He took a breath. I'm hoping that the man I'm becoming might be worthy of the woman I was too blind to see. Isabella was quiet for a long moment, studying his face with those remarkable eyes that had seen through him from the very beginning. The man who stood in that ballroom 6 months ago, she said finally, couldn't have built what we're going to build together. He couldn't have earned the loyalty I've watched you inspire in your employees, or the respect you've shown to everyone from the janitor to the board members. And now. Her smile was radiant, transforming her entire face. Now I'm looking at a man who learned that true power isn't about controlling others. It's about lifting them up. A man who discovered that respect isn't something you demand, it's something you earn. She stepped closer, close enough that he could see the gold flecks in her green eyes. A man who's become worthy of a real partnership. In business and in life. When Damien kissed her, it felt like coming home and setting sail at the same time. 6 months ago, he'd been a successful but empty man who measured worth by bank accounts and social status. Now, holding Isabella in his arms in the boardroom where she'd first challenged him to be better, he understood what true success looked like. Partners, he murmured against her lips. Partners, she confirmed, her voice warm with promise and possibility. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city stretched endlessly toward the horizon, full of potential and new beginnings. Together, they would build something unprecedented. A business empire founded on mutual respect, a partnership between equals, and a love story that had grown from the ashes of pride and prejudice into something beautiful and true. The girl he dismissed as unimportant had turned out to own his company. But more than that, she'd helped him discover the man he was capable of becoming. And in the end, that transformation was worth more than any fortune either of them possessed. As the sun set over Manhattan, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Damien Ashworth and Isabella Moreau stood together at the window of their shared empire, two souls who had found in each other not just business partners, but the missing pieces of themselves they hadn't even known they were looking for. The future stretched before them, bright with possibility and built on the strongest foundation of all. Not just love, but respect, understanding, and the knowledge that true wealth lies not in what you can take, but in what you can give. In the end, the billionaire who had mistaken the heiress for a gold digger discovered that the most precious treasure of all was the woman who had seen past his arrogance to the man he could become, and had chosen to help him find his way home to himself. If this story moved you, smash that subscribe button for more incredible tales of transformation and second chances. Remember, it's never too late to change, to grow, and to become the person worthy of the love and respect you seek. True success isn't measured in dollars, but in the lives we touch and the legacy we leave in the hearts of others.